Welcome to the after show.
Fired, Willow!
And if you haven't tuned out already after that, then good job.
Yes, thanks for hanging with us and going on this wonderful ride of Star Trek, because we like Star Trek, and hopefully you can tell by the episode and this after show that we like talking about Star Trek as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, well, this is our third, I guess, Star Trek review in 3 seasons of doing the podcast.
Wow, true.
And for this after show, we've actually decided to go ahead and do a deep dive on the Star Trek franchise, kind of like we did with Star Wars last time. So obviously, the logical place to start with is the original series. So
Yes.
Joe, do you have a memory of like when you first saw that or when you were first introduced to it?
I can't think of like a first for the actual original series itself. I know like I think when it became remastered and they updated graphics and stuff, that was the time where I was like, okay, I feel like I can watch this now because at least, part of it's updated, even if it's like really old,
Right.
watching stuff goes. I have this holodeck behind me, so I'm going to be dialing in, various locations and scenes for each, thing that we talk about, just to kind of, be part of the simulation. So computer,
Yeah.
load Enterprise bridge. No bloody A, B, C, or D.
Or D.
Exactly. So this is the background I used during the episode as well. But yeah, so the original series, I think we kind of talked a lot about this, in the episode, but like for me, it's hard to go back and watch some episodes because of the pacing is really slow and it feels dated, but some of the episodes are really interesting and can kind of hold attention. So it's definitely like,
Yeah.
it depends on which episode you talk about, because yeah, some are better
So
than others,
so
which
my
is true in most
impression
shows.
of the original series is that, so generally speaking, when you talk about Star Trek, almost all of the shows, at least up through Enterprise, the first couple seasons are considered kind of the tryout. We're figuring
Yeah.
out what the show is going to be, and then it really comes into its own in season 3. So that's true for Next Generation. That's true for Deep Space Nine. That's maybe not as true for Voyager. I think they really were just kind of
Yeah,
consistent the
true.
whole way through. But Enterprise also, it's season 3 where it really takes off. The original series, oddly enough, I can watch really most of season 1 and most of season 2, and that's where like 9/10 of their like knock it out of the park episodes are. Once you get
Hmm.
to season 3, it is a slog to get through the rest of it.
Yeah, that's
So,
true.
and that's really my impression of it overall, is that like their concept going into it was really strong, and you have obviously Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are the main characters. So at first, I believe that William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy were the only top billed actors, and then in season 2, DeForest Kelly got added to the actual opening credits. But
Hmm.
the people that we've come to know as like the original series crew are all credited as guest stars on TOS. Like their
Wow.
credits are at the end.
Yeah.
So James Doohan, Nichelle Nichols, Walter Koenig, George Takei, all of them are guest actors, and they were making guest actor pay until the movies when they, really
Sure.
kind of got top billing. But uh my introduction to it was probably just catching it randomly on a channel somewhere when I was a kid, and I
Hmm.
wasn't necessarily taken with it. It seemed really dated. It seemed really I don't know, just kind of hokey with the special effects technology of the day, and I
Yeah.
didn't really appreciate it for what it was. But once it was on Netflix and finally streaming and I could watch it all in sequence, I've actually come to really appreciate it and like it for what it is. So
Hmm.
it's definitely, very much an early version of Star Trek, but a lot of the concepts that are kind of core to the franchise will be set in place. Very much we're living in a utopian society. Starfleet and the Federation works as an organization. It's not, you know, oh, it's a utopia, but there's really something sinister underneath. Like, no,
Yeah.
it actually works. Like humanity has conquered their bigotries and things like that, despite while many episodes may treat women in a sexist fashion, which
Hmm.
is probably the thing that dates the show the most, um, the racial barriers seem to be have totally, erased within humanity. So it really kind of sets up the template for, what everything is going to be afterwards. I mean, you've got a crew of humans and aliens that are traveling through space, they're exploring the galaxy, and meanwhile, we're kind of learning about these characters as people as they go through these crazy sci-fi stories. And it was very like preachy out the gate as far as like we're dealing with social issues and things like that, and using science fiction as the lens to sort of view those things. So
Yeah.
in that regard, that was all kind of in place right from the get-go. Um
But that's also like a big thing that you have is, the creator, Gene Roddenberry, had a
mhm,
very heavy hand in the original series. And then he started to in The Next Generation, but then he passed away. So,
right.
since then it was everybody else kind of picking up that legacy and
Mhm.
continuing and maybe breaking some of the rules. I mean, he had some very strict rules, I think, on the original series about what you can and can't do. And it's sort of like how you have George Lucas with Star Wars, and like this is his vision for
Mhm.
it, and you're welcome to suggest an idea, but it needs to fit within his vision. And if it doesn't, because he's the creator of this, then you can't do that. Like if Dave
Yeah.
Filoni says, "Hey, I want to bring back this character," and George Lucas says, "No, that character's dead," you're that's it. You can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So I think it's very like that really shapes the way that the stories and movies go, is because you have a
Mhm.
sole person who says, this is my creative vision, and I will allow you to do certain things and I won't allow you to do certain other things.
Right. And I think it's worth noting too that the general concept for Deep Space Nine and Voyager was already sort of laid out, or maybe like a primitive version of a pilot written prior to Roddenberry's passing. So the
Hmm.
first show that existed 100% without any of his creative input at all was Enterprise. The other ones, even though he wasn't alive and he wasn't really involved in DS9 or Voyager, he did at least have sort of like a germ of an idea of like, oh, this is another thing we could do. We could do a show set on a
Yeah.
space station, or we could do like Lost in Space, but have it be Star Trek. Those were other things that were kind of like rolling around in
Hmm.
his brain. So yeah, but TOS is, I mean, the characters are very iconic. I feel like we don't necessarily learn as much about sort of the side characters and the rest of the crew except for Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And they get like a huge amount of character development and focus throughout the show.
Yeah.
And then certainly moving into the movies, we, see even more of what drives them. But I guess one of the most interesting things about TOS is that it is, to my knowledge, the only show in history to have two pilot episodes. So, The Cage was the original pilot episode of Star Trek, which was pitched to NBC, and it starred Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Christopher Pike, captain of the Enterprise. He had a first officer named Number One, that was female officer, played by Majel Barrett Roddenberry, later Roddenberry.
Hmm.
And also Spock was the science officer on that ship. So, and Doctor Mbenga, I believe, is their African American doctor as well. So all those characters present in the first pilot, and NBC sent it back to wherever they were producing this, and they were like, "We like the idea, we don't like your lead actor. Retool it and send us another pilot episode." So that turned into Where No Man Has Gone Before, which is the second pilot episode of the show. And that's the one that actually introduces Kirk. But what's interesting is there is a readout on the screen in The Cage, which shows the previous captain of the Enterprise before Pike, which is Captain Robert April. So that character will not ever be shown on screen until Strange New Worlds, but he does exist in continuity and did exist since the very beginning of the show.
Wow.
So it was just like a name drop that was like on a monitor, and yeah. So
Well, I
So
think
they're
that's important too. Is like not only did this show have 2 pilot episodes, but they
mhm,
actually managed to work the first pilot that was rejected into the canon.
mhm,
Like
yep,
they didn't just toss it away and say, "Ah, that's just, something we tried to do and it didn't work. Forget about it." It's like they actually tried to work it in because, it happens all the time where you have like you hire an actor, they test well, you start filming scenes and you're like, this just isn't working.
right,
And like Back to the Future, I mentioned during the episodes, like they had a
mhm,
different actor playing Marty McFly, and they were filming the scenes, and they're like, it's not there. And they
right,
later cast, Michael J. Fox, and he was actually the ones that are in the movie, but the original scenes that were filmed with the previous actor, like those just go to the wayside, and
mhm,
like maybe you can find them now on like YouTube or Instagram or wherever, but that's not actually part of the movie. Whereas the cage is actually part of Star Trek
right,
canon, which
yeah.
is, I think, another really cool aspect.
Yeah, it is. It's neat. I mean, and they do use clips of it. So originally when the show aired, that was not aired on network TV
Hmm.
until like years and years later. But it was chopped up and put into a two-parter called The Menagerie, where Captain Pike was on trial for going back to
Yeah.
this planet and he was paralyzed from the waist down and like in this space age wheelchair thing basically. More like what Professor X floats around in the X-Men
Hmm.
comics, I think. But that showed flashbacks and used clips from the cage so that they didn't just have that footage like destroyed or whatever. But
Yeah.
then it was several years later that eventually, Paramount like released that episode, and now it's considered just kind of like, well, this is where Star Trek begins. So it is pretty cool because I think that's something that sets the original series apart as well, is that within its history, you have three captains that did 5-year missions on the Enterprise. So first you had Captain Robert April, who we know like basically nothing about. Then we have Captain Pike, and then we have Captain Kirk. And so Kirk is like the third in the line, but he's also like very young and very like brash. And I think that was more what the network was wanting. They were wanting somebody that was more like a cowboy kind of character. I mean,
Yeah.
because like westerns were very big, and even Shatner had come from doing like cop shows and westerns and things like that. So
Right.
Have Gun Will Travel, and I can't remember the name of the other one, but yeah, but that was kind of the world he had come from. So he was considered at the time like maybe not like a big star, but he was already like a name that they could sell the show with. So that was
Right.
kind of the idea for bringing him on board. But as much as his acting is made fun of, the relationship between him and McCoy and Spock really is just that those three actors have great on-screen chemistry together. Like
Yeah.
it just works. When you see the three of them together in a scene, even if it's a bad episode, you can get through it if they have those moments together. Like that's
Right.
honestly what makes even the slowest episode of TOS watchable, is like, are they gonna have the sort of Kirk and Spock and McCoy like tete-a-tete where they're like going back and forth with different opinions, and maybe Dr. McCoy will drop, some sort of annoyed comment at Spock, and Spock comes back with logic or something really witty, and
Hmm.
and that's really
I'm a
the
doctor,
core
not a
of.
bricklayer. Got to
Yeah,
get those wise cracks in there.
we didn't talk about that in the episode, but there was they wanted him to examine the Tholian in the comic, and he said, "I'm a doctor, not a geologist,"
Yeah.
which I thought was hilarious.
It
So
was funny and very appropriate for the Tholians too.
yeah, for sure. So there are a few kind of like really big benchmark episodes that happened that I do want to call out just because they're really significant for the franchise overall. So The Enemy Within is like the fifth episode of the show, and a transporter double is made in that episode. So like that's something that transporter doubles and like shenanigans with the transporter is something that will happen like all throughout all
Yeah.
the shows, like till the end of time. So it's crazy that like that early in TOS they had one. And I don't know if you remember it, but like one was good and one was evil. And so
Mm.
evil Kirk had like dark eyeshadow around his eyes so that
Of
you could
course.
tell. And you're just like, how does no one notice that evil Kirk has dark eyeshadow?
It's like with the mirror
So
universe, like everybody has these really sharp goatees,
yes.
and that's how you know.
So So yeah, the transporter doubles, that's something that's set up. Another thing that the original series likes to hit on a lot is beings in space that have like godlike power and sort of
Hmm.
pitting the
Yeah.
Enterprise and science against whatever that power is. So that's definitely like a very original series thing that we see a lot of. The cloaking device is introduced on the original series the first time we meet the Romulans. So that's like a big thing that will be kind of carried forward. And then in Space Seed, they introduce Khan, who is arguably the greatest, like most evil villain of the original series era. So
Hmm.
that's really impactful because we've had now 2 movies dealing with Khan, and as of last week, an episode of Strange New Worlds that deals with Khan as well. So, which is pretty interesting. It's a time travel thing, but we'll get there when we get there. But yeah,
Okay.
that also is the first mention of the eugenics wars that happened in 1996. But if you don't remember them happening, there is a reason that they made up again a week ago for why you haven't seen that happen yet. So, uh,
That's another Star Trek thing that I feel like we've done several times, where it's like some kind of inconsistency either in the
yes.
fiction or in the factual world, that we
Mhm.
try to create some sort of reason as to why it happened that way. And it's
Mhm.
like you can argue, one way or another of, did we need to do that? Did we not need to do that? Could we have just not addressed it? Or, if the
Yeah.
reason is like crazy and quirky and doesn't make a lot of sense, then yeah, obviously we
Mhm.
didn't need it in the first place. But that's
Right.
happened a couple times.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And what Enterprise is going to be really heavy on that stuff. So once we
Yeah.
talk about Enterprise, we're really going to be talking about that. But uh, maybe not the most important episode of TOS, but the most like award winning is City on the Edge of Forever, which they actually did win a daytime Emmy for on the show. So that in
Hmm.
that episode, the Guardian of Forever takes Kirk, Spock, and McCoy back to like World War II era, and Kirk falls in love with a woman named Edith Keeler, who is a pacifist. And what they find out is that if she doesn't die, she will actually convince the United States not to join the war in World War II. Like she's that influential.
Hmm.
So what happens is in this really devastating line, Spock is like, Jim, Edith Keeler must die. And they have to like because she's supposed to die in a car accident, and
Sure.
they know that because of the like their historical files. But Kirk's fallen in love with her, and he's like, I don't want to let her die now. Like I want her to live, and so they actually have to allow her to be run over by a car so that history will play out the way it's supposed to, and their timeline will be preserved. So that concept of like the time travel rules of Star Trek are established very early. This is like season 2 of the show. And for the most part, they try to be kind of consistent with those rules of like you can, go to the past and do something, but you're always worried about like that butterfly effect and what's going to happen.
Hmm.
So, um,
Yeah, it's funny to like compare to Back to the Future again, because I think I've brought that up
mhm,
several times, not intentionally, but it correlates. So like in the third movie, right? So
mhm,
there's this lady whose horse is out of control and is about to go over a ledge, and so Doc saves her because she's a damsel in
mhm,
distress, whatever. And come to find out, she's, a famous person who was supposed to, and they're going to name this gorge after her because she was mysteriously killed in it. But now she
mm,
is alive. So now we've totally messed up the timeline. But it's neat because in that trilogy, they kind of like find a way to make it happen anyway. So they actually like, they take the DeLorean, to go 88 miles per hour, and you'll see some real
mhm.
serious stuff when that happens. But anyway, so they essentially make the same thing happen where they go over the cliff in the DeLorean, but then they go back to the future.
Right.
And so it looks like she gets killed there. And so then history proceeds as normal. So they don't really do that in Star Trek, I think, quite as much, where it's like,
Yeah.
if you do this, this bad thing will happen. So you can't do that. Okay, well, what if we did this? Then that thing could still happen, and we could still like bring her into the future with us, which I guess they kind of do in Star Trek 4, but we can get there later.
Yeah, it's
But
it's more it does seem within Star Trek that the rules of time travel are generally much stricter, where
It's
it's
like
like,
do or do
no,
not.
it
That's
has
it.
to happen exactly this way or it won't happen.
Right.
And so there are multiple instances, again, beginning with this episode of TOS,
Sure.
of seeing, oh, there's a time travel shenanigan thing that happened. We can't go back to our own time because it doesn't exist anymore. Like that,
Yeah.
the Federation's not there. There's no Starfleet. There's no anything. So, I guess we should touch on just conceptually what Star Trek is, because we haven't necessarily done that. In that, yeah, the idea behind it is basically it's a utopian society in the future where humanity has overcome all of their bigotries and hatreds. They've united as a species under one government and they're exploring space. And they're also part of the United Federation of Planets, which is this interplanetary organization that's, they're they're sort of like peacekeeping and exploration arm is Starfleet, whereas like the Federation is the group of planets that are all allied with each other. So, and contrary to what the Klingons may believe, it is not a monoculture. It's very much like every planet retains its own culture and
Mm-hmm.
values and all of that stuff, as long as they're willing to adhere to, whatever is on the Federation charter, basically. So
Right.
it's very much into like humanitarian work, exploring the galaxy, scientific research, and just sort of like reaching new life and bringing them into the family as well. So, later we have the Borg, where their idea is like, well, let's just force people to be a part of our organization. The Federation is kind of like the more benign version of that, where it's like, well, let's just ask people if they want to join. And
Yeah.
it's the intergalactic United Nations, basically. So,
Well, but like you said, they get to retain their
right,
individuality, whereas
right,
with the Borg, you don't. It's like we're all
no,
going to share one hive mind, and you'd think that would make us smarter, but it doesn't. But we're all going to pool our, collective intelligent resources and hang out in little
hmm
cell phone chargers, and that's our existence. Whereas the Federation's like, hey, you have your planet, do your stuff that way.
yeah,
We all just have this charter that we agree on, and they
mhm,
basically they don't police the galaxy, but they look for, if somebody's in distress, they'll help them. If there's some
mhm,
trouble that's happening, they won't necessarily interfere because they have this thing called a prime directive where they're not supposed to get in, to those
mhm,
kinds of like interplanetary disputes. But at the same time, if you need a third person or a third party or an arbitrator or something, it seems like they fulfill that role quite a bit, because it's like, hey, we were cruising around and we picked up that there was a disturbance and we're in the neighborhood. So if there's any way we can help, well, yeah, they started it. Well, they did this.
right,
Well, they suck. Well, hold on a second. Okay, so, maybe we can negotiate here. Like the captain of a starship has so many demands on them that they have to be, obviously they have to run this like pseudo military vessel. They
mhm,
have to be a negotiator, a diplomat. They have to be prepared to make first contact with an alien race and sort of set the precedent for not just humanity, but the entire, civilization of the United Federation of Planets, and represent, this large organization. And they have to be able to, know the ship well enough to direct all of these activities that are happening, like,
mhm,
hey, we're running out of warp power, or hey, gravity is failing, or hey, we're going to run out of air, or now I have to be a tactician because we're involved in combat. And it's like
right,
there are so many expectations upon a Starfleet captain that it's surprising that they're not a lot more military that they are, and things aren't more divvied up. Like you should
yeah,
have a diplomatic officer, you should have a, engineering, like the consultants are really the senior staff. So like your chief engineer,
right,
your chief tactical officer, they present options, but the
mhm.
captain really has to be like a jack of all trades kind of thing.
Yeah,
And what
and
they
and
say
I think
goes.
I think Kirk is specifically really indicative of that, because he is the character that, on at least on the original series, I don't necessarily view him as somebody that has like a deep understanding of science or a deep understanding of, he probably does understand battle tactics really well, because that seems
Yeah,
like something he's really good at. But or a deep understanding of like medicine or any, or technology, how to repair it, any of those things. But he is always able to know the right person to ask to get an opinion. And then he
sure.
takes those opinions and then he decides what to do. And once Kirk decides what they're going to do, like that's what they're going to do. There's no
Yeah,
like questioning him. Even Spock will like give him like, well, here's the logical thing that I think you should do. And if that's not what Kirk wants to do, he'll be like, I have a hunch we should go this way instead, and then
Hmm.
he's like, all right, well, I have to accept that. I guess you're the captain. So
Yeah.
the chain of command is well, it's funny. It feels like it's very much in place on the Enterprise itself, but when it comes to like admirals telling Kirk what to do, it seems like the chain of command is a little bit more broken down sometimes.
It really
So,
feels like that, that typical thing of like you have the people on the ground level who are doing the work, who know what's going on, and then you have, people sitting in chairs in an office who
hmm
have no idea what's actually going on, and they're kind of giving you the like either ideal version or the just do this, that's easy. And it's like, no, that actually isn't easy. You have no idea what you're talking about. That's kind of
right,
how it seems like Starfleet, like the admirals and everything are, where they're just like,
yeah,
just make first contact and blow this up and take this and then do that and it's fine. It's like, no, things are not that simple. Like we can't just go from point A to point B. It's not that easy.
yeah.
And you know what? Never mind. I'll do what I think is best because it usually works out that way anyway.
And that's another kind of story trope that will really be carried through Star Trek is sort of the misguided or the evil admiral. That's something we
Yeah.
do see on the original series as well. As early as like the second or third episode, we have I think a Commodore, which I don't even know what that rank is within Starfleet, but that comes on that's like, I think you should do things this way, Kirk, and I'm going to take command of your ship and
Yeah.
blah blah blah. And it's like, no. So I don't know. It's yeah, but I think the original series overall is much more watchable now that they've remastered it so you can watch it in HD. They've updated the effects. Not they did it very tastefully. So
Yeah.
they didn't do it like
Like
the
Star Wars,
Star
where they
Wars. Yeah.
added stupid scenes in that you didn't need and they look really rubbery and worse than if they had just left the original stuff
Right.
alone. Yeah.
It's more like it's just a clearer image of what like they were trying to do with, like tissue paper and
Yeah.
lights back then in the 60s. So,
That's
yeah.
another thing you got to give them credit for is like the way that they
Yeah.
put this show together. I mean, that was probably really hard to do and hadn't been done to this
Mhm.
level of production value. Like we look back at it now and it's just like, shaky cam and, all this stuff and
Right.
lean to the left and lean to the right and all that silly stuff. But it's like these people were pioneers of this,
Yeah.
genre of television back in the early 60s. Like I can't even imagine the time period and having to try to get something like this on the air and then
Mhm.
maintaining the momentum to keep it going episode after episode after episode. Like that's
Yeah.
wow.
A lot more and I mean that very much ties into something that will happen with really all the shows, which is Star Trek, generally speaking, is the most expensive show being produced by a network when it's on a network.
Hmm.
So we've moved away from the network TV model now. But even in the 60s, they were like, your ratings need to be phenomenal because you're spending all this money on, special effects and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And we need everybody to be tuning in and seeing those ads, basically to keep it going. So
Yep.
so I guess the only other thing to really discuss about TOS is its cultural impact. And so first of all, it's debatable whether or not they actually had the first interracial kiss on American TV. However, it was a very high profile television show that did it. And at least how long the scene runs and how much that of an impact that had can't really be denied. And Nichelle Nichols famously was going to quit the show after season 2 because she was
Yeah.
like, I don't think I want to do this. Like I'm a dancer, I'm a ballerina. That's what I'm trained to do. I want to go back to that. And you can find this interview on YouTube anywhere. I mean, it's pretty easy to find. But
Hmm.
Martin Luther King Jr. actually came to her and was like, "Your show is the only show that I'll let my kids watch on network TV because it's the only one where like our people are equal." Like, and she's like, "Well, I'm just like answering the phone basically." And he's like, "Yeah, but you're an officer on the ship. You're on the bridge. You're like with all the other people." And you're not like in some subservient role. And he's like, it's the only show I'll let them watch. You can't quit. So she was literally told by Martin Luther King Jr., do not quit Star Trek. And that's the
Yeah.
reason why she stayed on for season 3 and then all through the movies. So, um, that is a really big part of the show's cultural impact, and then also the basically the entire Comic-Con movement is credited to the Star Trek fan base. Conventions for fans did not exist before Trekkies existed.
Hmm.
That was something that they very much started and became this, kind of like grassroots thing in the United States where they would set up meet and greets where Trekkies could get together, and then eventually it's blown up into this giant, convention bubble that it is today. But right from the start, for some reason, Star Trek fans were very like anal about the details of the show, like wanting to look over technical manuals and all of this stuff, and rewatching, their tapes of them over and over and over. And it really started this explosion of fandom. So Star Trek, at least to my knowledge, is pretty much responsible for that con explosion that's now branched off into like comic books and Star Wars and Babylon 5 and whatever else you want to have an
Yeah.
interest in. So
Well, and that's the thing, especially with the original series, is even if they weren't the first, they were among the first. Like they were
yeah.
there at the beginning, way before a lot of other shows or movies or anything. And
Mhm.
speaking of cultural impact, I mean, it's like people see these characters, and like we may not think of it much today, but it's like you see these characters doing these things, and it makes you in your own personal life like give you inspiration of like,
Mhm.
okay, if she can be an officer on this ship, what can I do? And if this person can have these friends and really be kind of like directing things, but also be like open to hearing feedback and like taking a group approach of like, well, what do you think? Well, what do you think? Okay, here's what we need to do, like that kind of directive. It's like you see these dynamics of these people, and it's just something about it personally like resonates with
Yeah.
different people differently, of like
Mhm.
it helps me in my own life kind of visualize something that I could do based on the inspiration that I'm getting from this show. So now we're
Right.
kind of transcending that barrier between we're just watching fiction for entertainment and we're watching something that's giving me some kind of like personal satisfaction of like helping me in my own life of being
Right.
a better person. And there's so many stories out there about people who are like sick or struggling, or they're not
Mhm.
sure what to do with themselves, or they're even having suicidal thoughts. And it's like this show, just watching Star Trek, has helped me turn that around to where now I feel like I can be a functioning member of society, or I can figure out what my
Yeah.
personal desires will lead to, and something that I can do that would be very enjoyable. And it's like just
Mhm.
this science fiction show did that. Like, oh my gosh, like
Yeah.
it's had so much impact on people over the years that it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it really is. And that philosophy of well, it's the Vulcan philosophy, infinite diversity and infinite combinations, but that philosophy is very much like the philosophy behind the show, is that all these
Hmm.
different cultures and people can come together to accomplish a common goal. And so I think that that's, definitely something that we still need. It's definitely something that we should still strive for. And, particularly in the modern era where we're living in the divided states of America, I mean, very much, I mean, it's something that still resonates, I think, with audiences. and
Yeah.
and yeah, so it's a good thing. All right, so I guess we're ready to move on to Star Trek the Animated Series, which ran from 1973 to 1974. And I have only seen one episode of this, so it's going to be a short conversation, I think. But what are your impressions of the animated series from what you've seen of it so far?
I really didn't see that much of it. But one thing I have to do first, computer, load Star Trek the Animated Series bridge. Okay, there we go. I had to
Excellent.
change my holodeck background here.
Oh, I think
So
Captain Kirk is behind you too.
yes, he is. He is not moving though. He's frozen in animation.
Well, that's actually a good springboard to talking about the animated series because
Yeah.
it's not real animated.
Not really. So this is really fascinating to me because we had this TV show in, late 60s, and then
Hmm.
it was canceled, and then now we have this animated series that picks up in the 70s. Like, why was this the answer of what to do? Because we have the motion picture that comes out like, I don't know, 5 years or so after this show
Hmm.
ends, but it's like, why was this the way to continue it? And the way that they animated or lack of animated it, like the style and everything, is just like It seemed like a weird thing to do, and it's kind of a weird show.
So it's very much a Hanna-Barbera show. It very much
Yeah.
looks like a Hanna-Barbera show. And the sort of tricks of animation that they would use on shows like Scooby-Doo and Huckleberry Hound and all those, that whole generation of like early 70s, late to the late 70s animation from Hanna-Barbera. It looks like one of their shows. Now, the problem is normally in animation, you have a lot of movement, but with Star Trek in general, you have a lot of scenes of actors talking to each other. And
Yeah.
the performance is what's carrying you through that experience. Because, like I said before, DeForest Kelley and Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner have a lot of on screen chemistry together. So they play off of each other really well. Well, you don't get any of that when you're looking at like a still of their face that's been drawn on the panel or the animation cell, and their mouth is just flapping while their eyes blink. Yeah, it's
In
so
like a weird pose too, because they're like, ha
Yeah.
bah, bah, bah.
And I mean, if you've seen Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which greatly inspired the naming of this podcast,
Yes.
that those sort of stock positions that he goes into as well, that's taken from Hanna-Barbera animation. So they did have the entire original cast return, except who was it that didn't come back? I think it was either Sulu or Chekhov. It was one of those two. But they replaced, I think it was Chekhov, but they replaced him with like an alien crew member that was also voiced by James Doohan. So James Doohan did two voices on the show, and this guy had like I think like 3 arms or whatever. They also introduced the Cation race on this show, which can be seen in Star Trek Online. But the rights to Paramount actually owning that race are kind of iffy. So they don't use them a whole lot, and you don't really see them except for a really brief shot in one of the TOS movies. So there you go.
Interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah. Yeah, they actually have a Starfleet crew member that's Cation on that show. So,
well, shall I, computer, load the bridge from the Star Trek movies?
absolutely.
Ah, here we go.
Not the movie we're going to.
No, but I just picked one to represent all of them.
So, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, released in 1979, so that we're getting closer to the emergence of Mike White and Joe Getcho into the world here, but we're not quite there yet. But 1979, the motion picture released, and it is a very long movie, and it is actually a repurposed pilot for a different TV show that was going to be called Star Trek Phase 2. So that was the original intent, was to use these sets and all this production and stuff to make a full-blown series. And unfortunately, at the last minute, Paramount was like, no, we want you to repurpose that and just make a film, and it'll be like a one-off, because Star Wars did really well, and we want to have like a big science fiction film, to be our tentpole at this company. So they were kind of trying to compete with Fox, and that's why we have Star Trek: The Motion Picture ultimately instead of Star Trek Phase 2, which would have been, I mean, essentially what we get in this movie. It would have been the Enterprise crew, but adding on Commander Decker and Lieutenant Ilea. That was
competing with me, Decker.
Stop competing with me, Decker. Yes, exactly. But yeah, what are your thoughts on Star Trek: The Motion Picture?
Yeah, so this movie is very memorable for me, but I think there's also a lot of just so many things that, like, why did they do this? And I can kind of see like this being a TV plot that they expanded into a full motion picture or movie, and that not being quite enough substance to go there. But at the same time, like, I mean, their uniforms, why, like the direction, and then the weird like little box that they had there, it almost made it look like they were like androids or something, and that was their black box or the control box or something. And
the uniforms were all kind of gray and
and they all blended together,
drab colors.
And it was like, you know, so there's been all kinds of time travel episodes where they make fun of the Star Trek uniforms and they go, "Why are you in your pajamas?" You know, even in like the
Right.
TNG era and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
that's funny, but the motion picture really does look like they're
It
all wearing
does.
bland pajamas. I will say though that this really began the start, at least for me, of like
Mhm.
really good movie scores. Like, so typically you have a soundtrack that is like, you know, the popular music or any rock music or
Mhm.
like the vocal music that you hear people sing. Whereas when you say a music score, that's all the orchestra music that is played
Mhm.
during the movie. And so being, you know, very big nerds, Mike and I listen to a lot of movie scores. And I feel like a lot of it started from the Star Trek movies where
Yeah.
like we listen to them so much that it's like you listen to the orchestra piece and you know where we are in the movie. Or, you know, when certain hits happen in the movie, like Klingons firing on a ship, or, you know, V'ger destroying Klingon ships with like a whole bunch of electric bolts, like you hear that in the music and it starts to become more than just a movie and some, you know, orchestra playing some music, but it's like the two really start to blur together where it's like each one of
Yeah.
them is its own kind of experience. And even with Star Trek the Motion Picture, with all of its faults and being kind of weird and goofy and the bland uniforms and being very slow paced and like just watching
Yes.
the ship, hey, we're traveling through V'ger. All right, yep, here we go. We're still traveling. Here we go. You know, those kinds of things. The music is just like
The music
really
is actually
good.
what makes that tolerable, honestly.
Yeah.
It's really the unsung hero of Star Trek the Motion Picture. And I agree with you. So V'ger itself is there are a lot of things that I thought were being done with sound effects that are actually the score. Like every time it has like a flash of lightning or something, and you hear that boom,
Oh
boom,
yeah, it's
that
like
like
the
little
piano
yeah,
coils. Yeah, that's a very
uh-huh.
common like thing that they would do, especially in the olden days, is like using instruments and playing them not as actually intended, but
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, you have a hammer that when you hit the key, the hammer hits the string and that's what makes the beautiful piano sound. Well, you can
Right.
actually take like a bow from like a violin or a cello and you can rub it on those strings in the
Mm-hmm.
piano and you get like in First Contact and like with the Borg and stuff, you get those like really
Yeah.
high pitched mechanical sounds. Usually it's like taking a bow on the strings of a
Mm-hmm.
piano. So they incorporate a lot of those cool effects in the music too. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just, you know, music,
Yeah,
but
it's
it's that
the
too.
amount that Jerry Goldsmith was experimenting with sound and already trying to mix in electronic elements in
Yeah.
1979 really can't be understated. So, I mean, the score of that movie is really groundbreaking, even if the story it's hard for me to say if it's a bad story necessarily. I think it takes too long to get to the
Yeah.
story.
It was an interesting
Because
concept and a good
yeah.
idea and a cool story, but it just, yeah, there's too much padding around it.
Right. The last like the third act of the movie I think is good, but it
Mhm.
takes them way too long to get to that third act of that
Yeah.
movie. So basically from the point that Spock leaves the Enterprise in his spacesuit and goes into V'ger, and from there till the end, like I'm pretty engaged with what's going on. But before that point, when we've got like a good 30 minutes of them flying through different space orifices, I'm just like, oh my gosh. And the music is da, 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 da. And
Yeah. It's like
Sulu is
lulling you
being
to sleep.
hypnotized by it because he's like moving his head like this,
Yeah.
looking at the screen. But
Feel the
but
same
yeah,
way watching it.
they did they did do some interesting things with the crew in trying to shake it up with bringing Commander Decker on board as he was going to be the captain of the Enterprise.
Hmm.
He was going to be Captain Decker. And then Kirk does something pretty crappy to him and basically is like, "Well, Earth is in danger as the ranking officer here. I'm an admiral now, but I'm going to take over as captain of the Enterprise and keep you as first officer." And I'm just like, "Wow.
Out of
That
all the
was
episodes we've seen where some like that Commodore in the original series comes
yeah.
in and is like, I'm taking over your ship. And you're like, this guy's an idiot. Like, come on, get him out of here. Now Kirk is doing it to somebody else.
Yeah, so you got to feel for Commander Decker in this because
Yeah.
he gets put in a really difficult position. And of course, it's because they're going to write off the character at the end of the movie, but it's still a pretty crappy thing to do
Well, and
to him.
even McCoy calls him out on it too. It's like,
Yeah.
you're the one that's competing here. Like he's
Mhm.
just trying to do his job, and here you're muscling in on him.
Yeah, I mean, I think the parts of this movie that work do really work. It's
Mhm.
honestly just you could cut out like I would say at least 50% of the space sequences because they just pad the movie out with special effects that maybe were impressive at the time, but now just kind of look like, oh yeah, you're doing some like apogee effects in the computer. Like, all right, cool. Like it's it doesn't really impress. So
Yeah.
but the I do appreciate about that movie is that it does in a way feel like a Star Trek episode of TOS because you are dealing with here's another godlike intelligence that's come from space and what's humanity
Hmm.
going to do, and that's like a really common theme that they come back to in the original series a lot. So
Yeah.
that at least is the positive that I can say about it. So I guess next we have Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan in 1982.
That was a good year because we were
It
both born that
was.
year.
It was a good year.
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
I
Sorry.
was gonna say, yeah. So this movie feels a lot more like Star Trek has now matured, the original
Mhm,
series, and we get some new uniforms that actually look pretty good. They still look a little dated because they got like the bell bottoms or whatever wide legs
mhm.
at the bottom, but these are kind of some of my favorite uniforms,
Yeah.
and they look like they're really hot. Like I
They
bet that
do!
that it's like 1,000 degrees in there. And like, so they have the little thing that they can unclasp and then they can pull a panel open. And I bet that's to get some air in there because that's probably a thin material. And then you have like this wool on top of it. And I'm like, maybe when they're out like in the snow, that's great. And maybe they keep it cold on the ship. I don't know. But like you go anywhere slightly warm and you'd probably be sweating in that. But anyway,
Yeah, they look like they're cooking in those things. You're 100% right. Even the neck, like, the collar is so thick, and it's got, like, that
yeah,
piping, like, all
it's
the
like a
way around.
turtleneck.
Yeah, it's
Oh
oh,
man.
man.
But that aside, I really like the design of the uniforms. I think they look cool and they really suit the
Mhm.
original series cast. And I'm glad that we have that consistency not only through all of the original series movies, but also whenever we have any time travel in the Next Generation, we
Mhm.
see someone in who's from that era in that type of uniform. So we get to kind of see those come back. And it's like
Yeah.
when you see that uniform, kind of what era we're talking about or
Mhm.
what you know like it's around Kirk's time, towards the end of his career,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Like it very much dates it. And I think that's really good for consistency because like when you see this uniform, it's the Next Generation and it's, the transition before Deep Space Nine and Voyager where we have the colors
Right.
flip-flop and, that kind of thing. And there's certain uniforms that we ignore, like the ones on the first season of TNG, but we can talk about that when we get to that discussion. So uniforms, I think, a very important part of Star Trek, and this is really, I think, where they start to really take off and be
Well,
more than
yeah,
just a T-shirt or pajamas too.
it's something where you can immediately look at it and identify it as Star Trek. You know what
Hmm.
it is when you're looking at it. So the Delta, of course, is the element that's on all of them, for the
Yeah.
for the comm badge. And they didn't have comm badges in the original series, but there is one for Next Generation. But they always have that Delta on the uniform to represent Starfleet. So that's the element that you can always look to and go, "Oh, I'm watching a Star Trek show," and it's immediately identifiable. So
Hmm.
yeah, this is definitely the start of that. Uh, One of the interesting things about Wrath of Khan is that motion picture was directed by Gene Roddenberry and written by Gene Roddenberry. And so it's very much like, the creator doing his own thing. Now
Yeah.
we're hiring outside directors. So we have Nicholas Meyer come in to direct Wrath of Khan. And he took this in a much darker direction than they had gone with Star Trek before.
Hmm.
It's about the character of Khan, who was genetically engineered, and Kirk had left him on a planet supposedly to, survive with his remaining augments.
Buried alive. Buried alive.
In that Star Trek episode. But what happens here is that we find out that Kirk left them there, and they were not okay. Their
No.
sun exploded, and the planet shifted orbit, and it became like this desert wasteland. And so now, like half of Khan's crew has died, and they actually did a good job of like getting some of the actors that were in the TOS episode back to play like his genetically engineered people in this movie as well. And then of course Ricardo Montalban
Yeah.
has such a screen presence, and like he plays
It's at the Alpha 5.
exactly. Like
Yeah.
he is a larger than life villain deserving of the larger than life character that is Captain Kirk. So
Yeah, we have like a
it
true adversary for him that can
mhm,
think tactically and present a threat where Kirk's not just like, oh, I've got this figured out. Watch this,
right.
but it's like this is actually going to be a very challenge in the fight of his life to get through.
Mhm.
And they almost barely scrape through because
Yeah.
the Enterprise gets shot up and their shields aren't useful in the situation, and then they go into the nebula and like their sensors are inoperable and they have to figure their
Mhm.
way out, and it's like they have to do a lot of this like tactical analysis and thinking to figure out this whole situation. So this is very much like the arch villain versus our main protagonist and
Mhm.
crew, and how are they going to survive this. And the threat, I think, was very real in that movie.
Oh yeah, it feels like you genuinely feel like the characters are in real peril for one of the first
Mm.
times in this movie. And I mean, I think that's driven home by like we do see a lot more death actually happen in this movie. Midshipman Preston, who was Scotty's nephew, actually gets killed during the battle during one of the earlier sequences of the movie. And um and there's just a lot more like blood and and
Yeah.
explosions and death and things like that. But what I think it does well is it manages to balance the character stuff and keep that at the forefront, even though they're doing some action spectacle.
Hmm.
The action stuff does not take over it. And that's where really I feel the dividing line is with Star Wars versus Star Trek. Is if I'm just going to go on a ride and it's going to be a fun time. That was what I kind of got out of the Star Wars movies at the time, where I was like, with Star Trek, I want there to be more of a message or more like deep character studies or something more to grasp onto than just like things are blowing up. So
Yeah.
whether or not that analysis of Star Wars is still accurate today, I'm not saying that, but
Right.
that was kind of how I felt at the time. And so Khan really pushes the main characters to places that, well, for Chekhov for instance, gets like mind controlled for most of the movie. The Chekhov's captain, because Chekhov was assigned to another ship, Captain Dathan. I mean, Captain Terrell. Sorry, same actor.
Yeah.
He ends up killing himself because of the mind control and the stuff that Khan made him do. And so it gets pretty dark throughout the events of this movie. Some of it is only talked about, not shown, which is good because it would have.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me if this came out today. I very much believe it would have been PG-13, but because this was before the introduction of the PG-13 rating, there was PG and there was R. So they were like, well, this isn't dark enough to be an R-rated movie, so it was PG. But it's definitely, it would not be PG if it came out today.
Yeah, it'd probably be a lot darker and there'd be a lot of those, modern things in it. And,
Well, I'm just saying,
especially,
like, if it existed as it is,
oh,
if it
I
came out
gotcha.
today, like, I don't think it would still be
Just
rated
judge it by
PG.
today's standards.
Yeah, I
Gotcha.
think I think the MPAA would give it a higher rating.
Well, especially the end
Yeah.
where we have this very like touching scene where,
Hmm.
these characters that we've known and loved, I mean, from 1966 to 1982. So for people who were, you know, alive then, and also who were adults then and had seen these characters that, maybe they grew up with, or,
Right.
they had seen, and now it's like we're killing Spock, like, and he's not going to come
Hmm.
back in this movie, and you'll have to tune into the next movie 2 years later to see if Spock comes back. Like I was just like opening my eyes for the first time in my life. But probably
Right.
for people who saw that movie and then had to wait, that was probably like mind blowing. I don't know if there was
Yeah.
as much of that then as there is today, where we take a main character who's been established for a long time and we have this very memorable like death
Hmm.
scene for this character. And are they going to come back? Like, what the future of Star Trek is uncertain after this movie. Like,
Yeah.
what's going to happen? You can't have Kirk, Spock, and McCoy without Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. So Spock's gone.
Right.
Now what do you have?
It's very true. And I think that this is really the point too where Shatner and Nimoy and Kelly were just absolutely at the top of their game. So like they acted the heck out of this stuff, and
Yeah.
that really pulls all the emotion out of it that you need. Like the writing was there, but their performances like elevated it to be something so much better than it would have been with like just some random nobody in those roles.
Or
So
if they had done this in the 60s as well, when they were
yeah,
towards the beginning of their acting careers.
that's true. That's true. Like they're even Shatner, like I feel like, and we're gonna talk about his acting a lot when we get to Search for Spock, because there's one scene in particular that really stands out. But I think he was made fun of a lot. But by the time you get to the movies, I very much take him seriously. You know,
Yeah.
as the commander of the Enterprise, and you know he's definitely not a joke. So I think Wrath of Khan really cemented that, and fortunately the movie was a big success. What you
Hmm.
said about the future of Star Trek being uncertain was basically always the case after every
True.
movie. It was like after season 2 of TOS, they were like, we're probably going to be canceled. We don't know what's going to happen. And a fan campaign with letters and, you know, somebody peeing on one of the NBC executives, Hollywood star, and all this stuff going on.
We're
But
not saying go do that. That's just what happened
yeah.
in the past.
But the show got brought back for a third
Yes.
season.
That's the point. Yes.
After all of that happened. But it was kind of like that with the movies where they're like, if it makes enough money, we're going to keep going. Otherwise, Star Trek is dead. And that was always kind of the understanding.
Yeah.
So yeah, to kill Spock at the end of the movie was a big deal. Although they did very clearly write themselves sort of a back door into, well, maybe we could pick it up. And I think the thing that was the biggest part of the foreshadowing was that they actually had, um, excuse me, Leonard Nimoy read the Space, the Final Frontier over the end of
Mm. The end
over the end
credits.
of Wrath of Khan. Yeah, as it goes to the end credits, and then they show that his torpedo, that his body was in his soft landing.
True.
So that they had written in there, and that actually was forced on Nicholas Meyer. He wanted the movie to end with Spock is dead. That's it. It's a darker ending. It's those are the stakes. He sacrificed himself to save everyone. That's the end. And
Wow.
but the studio was like, you need to leave something in there just so that there's a chance for him to come back. So yeah, that was why we got the torpedo soft landing and
Gotcha.
all that. So this is an instance where studio interference maybe not so bad, you know.
Hey, it's bound to happen here and there, I guess.
But I guess the only part we haven't really touched on of Wrath of Khan is the introduction of Carol Marcus, who's Kirk's old love, and Kirk's son David Marcus, and they're both scientists working on the Genesis device, which is a device that can basically create a habitable planetary atmosphere out of nothing. So they can fire it at a dead moon, and boom, it can create a habitable planet. So
Watch out.
that's
We'll do it for you in 6 minutes.
exactly. Genesis? Um sorry,
Genesis permitted is not. Oh, wait. No, yeah. That's the next movie.
wrong
Whoops.
movie. Um
I have had enough of you.
you
So many
That's a
memorable
great Kirk
quotes.
acting moment. But yeah, this movie, it's funny because there is some humor between the characters, but it's definitely a much more serious movie than the motion picture. And really, um, any of the others until we get to Star Trek 6, I think. So,
Yeah.
and Kirk is really dealing with that issue at the forefront of like, I'm aging, I'm an admiral. And Spock even tells him in the beginning of the movie, if I can speak freely, you should never have accepted promotion. And Kirk is just like, wow, like
Thanks,
your
buddy.
your first, he's like, your first best destiny is captain of a starship. That's where you can be of most use, or what, something along those
Mm.
lines. But that really is the through line for Kirk's character for the rest of the movies, like him realizing that, okay, I'm actually supposed to be back on the bridge of the Enterprise, so I've got to find a way to like get there.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that really brings us to the end of Wrath of Khan. But I think it's a great movie. I think it's aged incredibly well.
Hmm.
The special effects, again, they're all practical effects using models and stuff. We've talked about it before, but I think that has aged better than early CGI has aged.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So
I mean,
it's
things have like more of a modern sheen on them today.
sure.
There's a lot there's a lot more like motion, so that when ships are fighting, we're not just kind of like moving and then we see stuff happening, but they're just like kind of zooming all over. So there's definitely, an explosion of that, like more
Right.
in modern stuff now. But as far as like the look and feel of it, it really doesn't feel that it's like, 40 years old.
No, no, it really doesn't. And I think that the character stuff holds up so well that you can get something out of it, even if you're like,
Yeah. And
oh,
it's
these
not a
effects are kind of dated.
it's not about the effects scenes.
Mm.
It's like you're not watching
Exactly.
it for the effects are just something that's happening to continue the story
Hmm.
along, so you can see what's happening outside of the ship, but that's not the main draw of it.
Right. So, well, you have anything else you want to say about Wrath of Khan? We move on.
Nada.
Well, in 1983, we have Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, which is directed by Leonard Nimoy.
83 or 84?
I'm sorry, 1984. We have Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, which is directed by Leonard Nimoy. You can edit that other
Yeah,
part out.
I can.
Uh,
But now I have to edit this out as well.
Do I have to say it again?
Up to you.
Was that too? So in 1984, we have Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, which was actually directed by Leonard Nimoy, which was a big deal at the time, but actually something
Yeah.
that will become a franchise, sort of a franchise staple, not just in the movies, but also in the TV shows, is having the actors become directors.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, kind of interesting. And especially a movie that's about the Spock character, having him
mhm,
direct, maybe helped with the treatment of the character, but also,
mhm.
helped because he wasn't in it quite as much. So that way he could kind of do double duty. Because if you have to direct something where you're like the primary star and you get all the screen time, that's probably a lot of work and would be
Yeah.
very difficult and stressful.
Well, and really, Spock only appears in this movie in the last scene.
Right.
So at least Spock, played by Leonard Nimoy, I should say, only appears in the last scene. He's played by other actors as he's like rapidly aging
Yeah. That's what
uh
I mean. That made
throughout
it
the
a
rest
lot
of the movie.
easier, I'm
But
sure, to
yeah,
direct.
yeah, for sure. But one thing that I think sets Star Trek 3 apart from Wrath of Khan, and it's really got a bigger impact on the further movies than maybe people realize, is that they really start to bring in humor between the characters in this movie more than they
Hmm.
have previously. So that was definitely a part of the show on the original series. And it's not like just, oh, we have a jokey atmosphere all the time, but we might have some witty barbs here and there.
Yeah.
And Search for Spock really is the movie for me where it feels like they started to really do that again, where, Kirk is checking on Dr. McCoy in the infirmary and he's like, I heard that you're fruitier than a nutcake. And, the doctor's like, that's not very darn funny or whatever. And, all of their kind of back and forth
Yeah.
to seeing Uhura shove an ensign into a clothes locker by pulling a phaser on him while she's running a transporter. I mean, all of those things are like, you can tell that these people like each other. And I think
Yeah.
that that really comes across in Star Trek 3 because this movie, they're very much going on this journey to save their friend and find a way to maybe, bring him back to life because his consciousness is trapped in Dr. McCoy's head. His body is on the Genesis planet and they have to find some way to do something about it. But the Genesis planet has become planet forbidden in this time.
Yes.
So it's a big diplomatic incident. The Klingons aren't happy that they made it. The Romulans are not happy that they made it. And they're like, so what? You're just going to go around the galaxy and start making Federation planets? Like, we're not okay with that. So it becomes this big problem for the
Yeah.
diplomats. Meanwhile, Kirk is like, we've got to go back there. So they actually steal the Enterprise
Yeah,
from
because the
space dock.
Enterprise is, yeah,
Yeah.
quarantined as well. And they're like,
And
no
well, and they're
Enterprise, no planet.
they're going to decommission it too, I think was what they were planning on doing because this is the still the Enterprise 1701. It's
Right.
refit, but it's not the 1701A yet. They're like, it's taken a beating. And actually, when you see it come into space dock in this movie, it's just got like black marks all over it. Like the nacelles
Yeah.
are trashed. Like it looks so bad. So, um, but yeah, I think really the legacy of this movie is that they really realized we need to have fun scenes between Kirk and McCoy, Kirk and Spock. Things like that that really remind us that these characters care about each other and that they get along well, and we like to see those character interactions.
I think that's
And
centric to the storytelling too. Like even
yeah.
in Wrath of Khan, we had a couple moments, right? So like
Mhm.
they're going to the transporter to go to that like underground cave that they
Oh,
have,
yeah.
and they're like, we're gonna go. Where are we going? Well, we're gonna go where they went. Well, suppose they went nowhere. Well, then this will be your big chance to get away from it all. You know, just
Oh,
like
yeah,
those
I forgot
funny
about
little
that.
interactions, and then it's
Yeah.
like they beam out there, and now it's serious, and we're figuring out what's going on. But
Right.
it's like it's not the like Marvel kind of humor, and I hate to diss on
Right.
Marvel because I like a lot of the shows and movies, but
Sure.
like
Yeah.
there are times where the humor just doesn't land, or it's very inappropriate, or it just really ruins it. Or like in
Mhm.
Aquaman we mentioned before, where
Yeah.
like they need the water to activate the thing, and he's like, I could have just peed on it. Like we didn't need that joke.
Ugh.
That was not funny. But
No.
the humor that's in Star Trek is really, it's between the characters, and it's not like a quip or a throwaway or whatever. It's just like it's just real people. It feels like real people
Yeah.
interacting with each
Yeah.
other. And I think
It's
that's what
like
makes it so good.
you've worked with these people for years, and this is how you guys kind of banter with each
Yeah.
other. That's what it feels like. Um, so that said, as much humor as is in this movie, it is extremely emotionally intense right in the middle of it. Because we do see David Marcus returns from the previous movie, and also Lieutenant Savick, who was played originally by Kirstie Alley, but she's played by Robin Curtis in this movie. Because since Star Trek 2 happened, Cheers has happened, and now Kirstie Alley is a big star. And
Yeah.
she was like, give me millions of dollars more. And they were like, no, we'll recast you. So
Yep.
that's what they did. But yeah, David Marcus is killed by the Klingons in this. In He's basically stabbed in the stomach by Duktog, which is their knives that have the two prongs that open up. I don't know if you have one of those handy,
I don't
Joe. Do
have
you
one of
have?
those. I
Oh,
just
you just
have
have
the
the
Klingon
Klingon disruptor.
disruptor.
Well, those
Yeah,
are the disruptors that you would see in Star Trek 3 as well.
that's true.
So, so yeah, the Klingons actually killed David, and in a pretty brutal scene. What happens is just slightly off camera, but it's enough for you to like you feel the hit when it happens.
Yeah.
It's pretty rough. So I guess just sort of continuing the thought process of talking about Shatner's acting and how he's not really, I don't think of him as a joke. The search for Spock really cements that, because after David dies, he does this thing, and we don't know if it was an accident or if it was on purpose, but he sort of like stumbles backwards and he misses his chair, like just barely, and
Mm,
sort of like slides off of it onto the deck. And before his famous, Klingon bastards killed my son, that line,
yeah.
the line sounds cheesy, but like the way that he falls back and the look on his face and the way that he delivers it is like, it's at the same time, it's so James T. Kirk, and it's also like, this is a really great performance. Like, he really nails the emotion of that scene, and like, you believe what the character's going through. So, again, uh, Shatner gets a lot of crap, but that scene alone, I feel like, is very much like, that was a very good acting moment that really elevated the movie. Like, that little stumble off the chair was so much of an added thing. And I've seen interviews with Nimoy where he was like, I didn't tell him to do that. So he's like, I don't know if it was an accident or if it was Bill's choice or whatever,
Yeah.
but either
But
way,
it worked.
it was great for the movie. So it's kind of another one of those things like you were talking about with Back to the Future, where it's like, if it was an accident, then it was like lightning in a bottle, and we captured it on film, and now we're gonna, use that as part of the movie. So
Right.
I feel
We
like there's a
can't
lot of
reproduce
those.
it on
Yeah.
command.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of those things where like modern film directors will try and like recreate things like that, and it's like, well, the reason it's so special is because it just happened on the day. And
Yeah.
like, that's why it's so cool. So I don't
Well, I
know.
think this transformation starts to happen when you have these actors who play these roles for such a long time that,
Mhm.
the actor really has to sort of bring out parts of themselves and kind of change how they act to be able to portray this role. And then after doing it for a while, it like the inverse starts to happen where the role sort of starts to become like the person. And so they
Mhm.
start bringing a lot more of their personality into it, to where they're really, it probably doesn't even feel like acting at some point, where,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you're acting because it's not you, but it doesn't feel like it's something where you have to go, okay, you know, what would this character do and what would this character think? Like it starts to
Right.
be a lot more natural.
Mhm.
So I think that's where we get these really great acting moments, is where we have these actors who are
Mhm.
so in depth with these characters that they're like, I don't have to sit and think about how this character is going to react to this scene. Like
Right.
I just know instinctually that I need to fall back and I'm stunned and I don't know, because Kirk had all of this wrapped in with David about like, this is my son, but I don't know who I am without Starfleet. I don't even know who I am without the captain's chair. Like,
Mhm.
I don't know who I am as an admiral. And, you know, now I've got this son. What am I going to teach him? And how am I going to, what am I going to tell him? And what if he wants to join Starfleet? And he's probably got all these thoughts going in his head about how am I going to handle, because this is all he has to think about besides Starfleet. And then he sees him killed and all of that just poof goes away.
Well, not just that, but he had pretty much thrown away Starfleet in this movie, if you think about it, because they've basically committed treason
Yeah,
by stealing the
stealing the ship.
Enterprise and going to the one planet that they're not allowed to go to with it. So that's really, at this point, Kirk has kind of blown up his entire life, and then
Yeah,
he has his son taken away from him too. So it's just like, yeah,
of
it's
course you
a
would fall over and miss your chair and be
right,
like
yeah,
stunned.
exactly. Like,
There's, what can you say? There's nothing to say about
yeah,
that.
there
Like,
really isn't. And I like how he even like he starts, he doesn't say anything for a minute, and then like he starts quietly, and then he gets more and more intense, and that's that James Kirk, I'm formulating a plan, and the plan isn't really to save us at that point, it's just to kill the Klingons.
yeah,
Honestly, like that's all that's on his mind at that point. But I
yeah.
guess
We're on the.
kudos to oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say we're on the bridge, and the computer appears to be the only thing speaking. What's it saying? 3, 2, 1.
Get out! Get out of there!
Like, not only does he kill the Klingons, but it's in a very like, it's almost in a comical, like funny way how they do that,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not funny at the same time. Like,
Well, you know, this is the first time that we've seen a hero ship destroyed in all of
yeah,
Star Trek, and he blows up the Enterprise. And that in and of itself, I think, was pretty shocking. Like, how are they going to top themselves after killing Spock in the previous movie? Well,
right.
blowing up the Enterprise was pretty good
Yep. Now what
because
are we gonna do? We have no ship.
they have such a relationship with the ship. You know, they refer to her as a woman, and all of this stuff on the show, and it's like the ship is their home, it's not Earth, and all of these things. So it's really shocking to see that all go up in flames. And then, you know, it even leads into that scene where Kirk is like, Bones, what have I done? You know,
Mm,
and he's just like, and then he has that great line of, what you always do, you've turned death into a fighting chance to live. That is a great line.
yeah.
Like, oh my god.
Well, and so much like Kirk isn't looking to sacrifice himself. He isn't looking to go down with the
Right.
ship. He isn't looking to make a stand. It's like, this is, you know, almost as much about survival. And
Yeah.
that's what leads them to steal the ship in the first place and commit this treason, is like,
Mhm.
this isn't just a coworker, you know, this is, and it's not the hokey, like a company will tell
Right.
you, well, we're family here. No, not like that. But
No, it's
they actually are a family. Like, they've
mhm,
been together for so long that they think of each
mhm.
other as brothers, and they're going to do anything that they can to, you know, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. Well, actually,
Yeah.
no, it's like the needs of the one outweigh anything else. Like, if you need help, we're here for you no matter
Right.
what, like whatever it takes.
Yeah, I really like that sentiment, and that carries through, you know, these three. You can really look at Star Trek 2, 3, and then eventually 4 as a trilogy, as far as the character arc that Kirk goes through, the journey that Spock goes through, and all of that, and then them eventually returning home and having everything resolved.
Hmm.
But yeah, Star Trek 3, I think, kind of underrated. It is an odd numbered movie. It does have some slow sections where like David and Savick are on the Genesis planet, and it's just kind of plodding along a little bit. But overall, I think it's pretty good, and
Yeah.
it's definitely like necessary tissue to connect where the franchise was going to go from here. All right, so in 1986, we have Star Trek 4: The Voyage Home,
The one with the whales.
aka the one with the whales.
Sorry to
Yep.
spoil it. I didn't know you were going to say that. But yes,
Yes.
if you're not sure which Star Trek this is, it's the one with the whales. There be whales here.
And if you thought humor was a part of the previous movie, this is very much like a sci-fi comedy in a lot of ways.
Even the music is comical.
Yeah, it is. They got a different composer. So we didn't talk about the score in Wrath of Kahn or Search for Spock, but James Horner, very early in his career, did Wrath of Kahn. In fact, I think it was one of his very first movies that he did was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Kahn. So obviously James Horner goes on to become an Oscar-winning, film composer, but he wasn't really that much of a name at the time. But he wrote the themes for 2 and 3, and then I believe it is Leonard Rosenman for Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, and he only did that movie. So but it makes sense. It definitely has a lighter tone, although the actual events of what are happening in the 23rd century are kind of serious because there's a probe from outer space that apparently had been communicating across space with the humpback whales on Earth, and it stopped hearing from them because they were hunted to extinction. And this was like a legitimate concern in the 1980s. We're like, is this species going to still survive?
Yeah.
We don't know. So the idea is that this probe traveled to Earth over like several hundred years. Like it took it that long to get here because I guess it doesn't have warp drive or something to see what happened. And it starts vaporizing the oceans on planet Earth in order to get to where the whales are.
Yeah,
so,
it's not just trying to communicate with them and be like, hey, bro, where'd all the whales go? It's like, there were whales here. What happened to them? We will tear this planet apart until we figure it out. Like, it's a very serious threat to the point where Starfleet's just like, I don't know what to do, and we're in trouble, and this thing's going to destroy us. And I guess don't come to Earth because things are not good here.
Right. Yeah. So meanwhile, Kirk and the rest of the Enterprise crew are traveling back on the HMS Bounty, which is their renamed Klingon bird of prey that they captured in the previous movie. And they're expecting to go stand trial. Well, instead, they find out that Earth's oceans are being vaporized and the sun is being blocked. No matter what happens, Mr. President, we cannot survive without the sun. Yes, I'm well aware of that. I remember that line from the movie.
Sorry, I unplugged my headset. What did you say?
I remember that line from the movie where he's like, no matter what happens, Mr. President, we cannot survive without the sun. And the Federation president just looks at the guy like, yes, I'm well aware of that.
Well, it's interesting because like the Federation president is usually non-human, so maybe their race could survive without the sun, and he was letting him know. I don't know. But it didn't seem that way. It was just kind of like one of those lines where it's like, thank you for letting us know that. We hopefully are aware of that.
Right. But we do have Ambassador Sarek back on Earth in this story as well, which again adds a little more urgency to it because now there's like a character, it's Spock's father, that we care about that's stranded on Earth while it's basically being destroyed.
I wonder where Michael was at this point.
Well, Michael didn't exist yet. That's why. Maybe. Oh, wait. No, we know where Michael is. Michael's in the 32nd century.
Oh, yeah. By this point, they would have been gone. That's right.
So
you said Sarek, and immediately my mind went to, well, where's Michael? Because, that whole thing. We can talk about that.
Yeah, well, Cybok is supposedly out there somewhere, too.
Oh, that's true. Laughing it up somewhere.
Yeah, so pretty much what happens is they go back to the 1980s using the Klingon bird of prey by slingshotting around the sun because it is that easy to time travel.
It's these Klingon crystals, sir. I think the time jump drained them. So it has some effects on the ship, and they have to not only figure out how to get the whales, but also how to get the ship to be able to go back around the sun again, to come back to the future with these whales, keeping them on the ship that's not Starfleet. So it's a little, foreign technology to them, all the while trying not to contaminate the timeline, but also plucking someone out of time and bringing them to the future. So it's very much a TOS thing of like, we're here and we're really not supposed to interfere, but we're kind of interfering, and we're going to leave things like not necessarily wrapped up in a tidy bow, but it's okay because we're out of here. And So that I think that's what's neat about this is this one truly to me feels like an episode that has been blown
Yeah.
up into a movie that doesn't feel like the motion picture where it dragged. Whereas the
Yeah.
previous, Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock really felt like feature films. This one was like,
Mhm.
this is a fun little, episode, and
Yeah.
it's a two-parter or the length of a movie.
Yeah, like the stakes are high, but for most of the story, you're not really thinking about what's happening to Earth because you're focusing on the culture shock of seeing these 23rd century people deal with 1980s America. And,
Terra incognita.
right. Many of their customs will doubtless take us by surprise.
Well,
Uh,
you.
yeah, and the whole sequence with Chekhov being a Russian person in 1980s America asking a police officer, "Where do you keep your nuclear vessel?"
That's what I said, Alameda. That's what I said.
And the police officer just staring at him like, "You're Russian. What are you doing?" Right?
Well, of course he's a Rusky, but he's like, yeah, they kind of go off on a whole tangent about what's
Oh
your
yeah.
name? My name? No, my name. I do not know your name. Like,
Well, everything is so literal in the 23rd century. It's so
I
it
guess
it
so.
is it is really fun to see these characters play off of other people in this time period. And whenever they have like our future guys go back into a time period and they don't take advantage of that sort of culture shock thing, I feel like it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
There's I think Enterprise did it at least once where that was with Vulcans showing up in like 1950s America. But
Yeah.
but
But that's
there's a
almost funnier
yeah, it is
when it's
almost funnier.
non-humans.
It's non-humans, but I have seen them do it on Star Trek where they will go back to the past, but they don't. Well, Picard actually was an example of that, where like they sort of do like a cursory thing about like, wow, this time period sucks, but they don't actually like really show them interacting with that time period in any meaningful
What about
way.
the Ferengi?
Ugh.
I
Oh
think
my
they're trying to communicate.
gosh.
What did they do?
On Deep Space
I
Nine,
think that's the mother, and it's like, what are they doing?
they're trying to get their universal translators to
Yeah.
work. Yeah, so that I mean, Voyage Home really sets up that like we can have a cool sci-fi story and we can also have like a lot of comedy at the
Hmm.
same time, and it just works, like it just does.
And colorful
So,
metaphors.
and lots of colorful metaphors. Yes, there's a lot more swearing in this movie because they go to the 80s than there is until Star Trek 5 when there's a lot of swearing again. Uh Particularly in one scene, but
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. But yeah, it's just a fun movie. It is a little weird that they take a cetacean biologist from the 80s and bring her, to the year
Hey,
2023 whatever or
Kirk
22 whatever.
Kirk thought she was good looking, so I mean that's his MO. Hey, I think you're good looking. I think I'll steal you out of time. What else you got to
Oh
do?
my god. She's like, I don't have anywhere to go. I don't have anyone.
And he just kind of ditches her at the end of the movie, like, "Hey, I've got a job with Starfleet. Great, have fun, babe. We're done here. Go
Yeah,
have
and you
fun."
never see her again. But what the awesome part about the end of this movie though is that it really does something that we don't really do with the original series is long-term continuity and seeing consequences of actions. And this movie really is all about the consequences of what they did in Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock as far as what's happening in the future. So when they go on trial at the end, it's like you went back to the Genesis planet you weren't supposed to. You destroyed the Enterprise and you stole it. You weren't supposed to do that. Like you've done all of these things and broken all of those laws.
Yeah.
And it seems like the right chain of command thing to do would be to just like remove Kirk from Starfleet entirely at this
Hmm.
point. But because he just brought these whales back and saved the entire planet and they would all be dead if not for him, they demote him from admiral to captain, which actually is like giving him a reward
I don't see this as
because
a negative. Yeah, exactly.
exactly. Because his whole character up to this point has been like, I don't know who I am if I'm not the captain of the Enterprise. So we finally, at the end of Star Trek 4, restore him to where he's intended to be. And there's also a really nice full circle moment between Sarek and Spock at the end that I think it addresses some stuff that was brought up in the original series show where Sarek and Spock are very much estranged because Spock
Of Michael.
is Yeah. Yes. Yes. Of course. Um, no, they're estranged because because Spock was a little too human, because he went into Starfleet instead of the Vulcan Science Directorate. He made all these decisions that his father didn't agree with, and at the end of Star Trek 4, you kind of get that moment where he doesn't exactly apologize, but he's like, "It appears I would have been in error. Your comrades are people of good character." And then Spock has what would be considered an emotional outburst to a Vulcan, and he says, "They are my friends." And then Sarek looks uncomfortable again, and he's like, "Of course."
Of course, you would
but
say something so
but
emotional.
yeah, but you finally get that moment of them kind of reconciling, which is really neat.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And then they reward Kirk again by giving him a new ship.
yes,
Like, okay, this guy broke how many, like, I get that we're, taking into consideration that he just saved, probably the Federation and, everybody on Earth and all of this stuff. But like, look at this guy's track record. You're just going to set him out there as captain on a new ship and say, hey, go, mate with the locals and run away. It's okay. Go do your thing that you used to do. Like, maybe we could have him file papers in the back or something. Like you maybe keep him in Starfleet, but keep him out of sight. Like, but no, he just get carte blanche to go back out into the galaxy and do what he does best.
Well, and it's funny because in the real world, this would not happen. But
No.
also in the Star Trek world, I don't think this would happen in the 24th century. But it seems like they play fast and loose with the rules in the 23rd century. And I mean, that's even something that it becomes kind of a staple of the original series, so much that like future characters and future series will even comment on it. Like
Yeah.
Janeway later is like, well, it was a different time, and they had to break a few rules because the frontier wasn't settled yet and all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas where we're going to be heading into next time, the next generation, is the frontier very much is settled. Now we're trying to like keep the peace.
Yeah.
Is kind of where that starts. So
Yep.
yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a fun after show. So make sure you tune in next time when we go into the next generation, and you better, because I'm holding a phaser at you.
You fired it.
I fired it.
Well, you can't threaten me if you're actively shooting me. It has to be the threat of shooting me.
Oh, okay. Well, here, let me use my tricorder, and I will rewire the circuits to generate a pulse that will send a rocket to the sun, which will only take a couple seconds, and it will loop around and take us back in time. And now I have my phaser again, and now I'm holding it at you, but I'm not going to fire it, because I've learned from the alternate reality that no longer exists. And that's
Star Trek logic. All right.
And there you have it.
Everybody for watching.
Thanks so much. Joda Enterprise, one to beam up.
True.
Admiral, there be whales here.